Hi everybody. I guess welcome back to Code Talk Teach, our kind of technology talk show here at Oasis Digital. I am Kyle Cordes, and we'll kind of go around here. Everybody introduce yourself.
I'm Paul Spears.
Lance Finney.
Chris Harden.
And we have several topics this week, but just if you're here for the main topic, which is about kind of the whole UX developer idea, sit tight. We have something to talk about for just a couple of minutes first, then we're going to get into that. The thing I wanted to talk about first briefly is we have this thing coming up called Angular for Architects, which is kind of Paul's baby. Paul, we talked about it here on the show a couple of times before. How is Angular Architects coming along? Angular for Architects.
It's doing pretty good. We have one more class that we're going to have as kind of like this beta class where we're still trying to figure out the mechanics of actually delivering the material. But really excited. I think Chris is going to be joining me on this next one. And so she'll be able to spot all the things that we've missed so far. I know she's coming from a very different background than I am, so I'm excited to hear her interject and add her experience to the story. But yeah, it's been really great. We've had a lot of people kind of follow up afterwards, reaching out for additional comments and topics and discussions, and yeah, it's exciting.
Yeah, I didn't get to attend it. I was kind of hoping to, but I've been doing other roles here. But I don't know. It seems like the sort of thing that I would give my left arm to attend that when I was first starting with building big systems in Angular anyway.
Yeah, I know. We've had a lot of people that are wanting to kind of like skip ahead. Also, we've had people reach out that were thinking about an Angular bootcamp, and they're like, "Well, but I hear all this cool stuff about like NX and Nest and code sharing and library management and architecture, and like I want to learn about all those." I'm like, that's great and all, but you really kind of have to have had a little bit of experience with Angular before you take the Angular for Architects class, because we kind of assume going in that you're already using Angular as a professional, and that this class is really meant to just add that next organizational, the conceptual level of how to organize and capture those key critical ideas within your organization and translate that into like reusable, shareable software components. Yeah, it's really exciting. I'm glad we were able to do it.
Yeah, now we've been talking about, we kind of wonder, as Angular has become quite mature and broadly used, we wonder if we're going to see like a big shift in sort of everybody who started out wanting to learn Angular, shifting to wanting to understand the stuff for its scale. And of course, we call this Angular for Architects, but what percentage of it you think is really only relevant if you're using Angular?
If you're only using Angular?
It's only relevant to you if you're an Angular operation. I mean, versus what is like if you're building anything on the web platform, you might learn something.
Yeah, we had several folks that were in the last class that were various kind of forms of developers, that some of them actually did not know Angular, and they kind of knew going in that we're just going to have to gloss over the Angular parts and just listen to the architecture parts. Yeah, and they were really thrilled with the class. I don't know about a percent breakdown. I mean, we look at code extensively, but there are so many words surrounding that code and the ideas behind the code and what the code is trying to achieve that aren't related to Angular, that it's really hard to give an actual breakdown, because they go hand in hand. The code's all in Angular, but the topics are largely not Angular, interestingly enough.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I almost wonder if at some point it might span more than Angular, sort of web platform system architecture or something. But yeah, it's just an idea. But anybody else have any sort of news of the week worthy of discussing before we get to our main topic?
Lance, you're on mute there.
Yeah, well, what you missed was the very exciting "Nothing Comes to Mind." I'm sorry. So
Exciting and relevant, certainly.
yes.
Certainly. Okay, well, so
I got one quick little thing.
Oh yeah, sure, absolutely.
Like, man, NFTs are really hot right now.
So hot, and we don't know what's going to happen with all this, but we keep thinking, like, is this going to somehow end up being relevant to like software governance in some way? So somehow related to attributing credit for code that gets contributed, that it becomes part of the system. I really wonder if some of that world is going to like arrive in our world.
Source code dependency management, blockchain level verification within your own internal company blockchain, there's something there.
And I don't know enough about it to know how it might come to our world, but it just sure seems like it could. We could wake up tomorrow and it could be the next big thing in like scaled software development, like attribution control, that kind of thing. Yeah. Meanwhile, like, I didn't know digital art was a big thing. Apparently, it is a very big thing. Okay, anything else before we jump to our main topic? Okay, so the main topic, we announced that people are probably listening. Someone is probably writing a comment right now in the YouTube that the real thing starts 7 minutes in, so you can skip everything else. So we want to talk about this idea of a UX developer. At least that's one name for this concept. There's the idea floating around that the ideal front-end developer, or maybe even the ideal full-stack developer, somehow spans all the way from like internal implementation of a software system to like designing the appearance and behavior of the user interface of that software system. Now, there's a bunch of different words here. I'm sure we're going to spend the next hour picking apart the way all the different words might refer to different things. But really what the main idea I want to get to is the fundamental notion of people that span between development and the UX UI end of things. Like, is that like a wild, crazy, like I put out a job search for a unicorn and no unicorns applied? Like, is it that? Or is it kind of like table stakes of where we're all heading? Like 5 years from now, will sort of every full stack developer like learn in school to have like a pretty good understanding of UX? Or is it somewhere in between? So that's kind of where I want to get to. But I guess first we got to start teasing apart what these words mean. So somebody take it away. What's a UX? What's a UI? What's a developer? What's a designer? How do these people fit together in teams? I'm getting some notes ready to screen share once they start appearing. Paul, you look like words are.
I don't want to use up all the word budget.
Maybe you can introduce some more of the words and use up a little of the word budget.
So when Kyle first introduced this topic internally as like the subject line of the next show, I immediately like messaged him and I was like, hey, like, did you make a mistake? Didn't you really mean to say X, Y, and Z? Because like right out of the gate, there was a disconnect between like the words and the description and how someone could interpret those two things differently from one another. And that there's so many tiers and layers there. Like depending on what you're doing, they all matter, each individually a whole bunch or not at all. So like in my opinion, like there isn't a one right answer to your opening question. And it's because of these words that we're about to tease out, right?
We want to tease it out. We want to get. We dig the complexity. We don't look for easy answers.
So let's start by like taking out the acronyms. Like UX, that's user experience, and UI is user interface. A lot of people think that's the same thing.
No.
And it's simply not. The user experience is, in my opinion, in my experience, is that it's describing the way the user experiences your application or your website or your product. Now, the UI is a central piece of that experience, but it is not anywhere near the whole thing. The experience also includes things like, how the screens flow from one thing to the next. Where is information located? How easy is it to get to information? Like, what kind of affordances are on the screen to help you navigate and understand the actions behind the elements? It is everything from, like, do I use a modal dialog here, or do I do a toaster pop-up, or do I just open up another little visual panel on the same screen? It has, like, how do errors get communicated to the user? He's writing a list. Do I need to slow down there?
No, I thought I should probably start capturing some of these ideas that you're talking about. Oh, that is not at all what I wanted to do. I somehow clicked the wrong thing, and it made my window very large. Let me find a way to wrangle this back under control.
Yeah.
Sometimes a Mac does not do very helpful things. It's all imagined to be very helpful, but every once in a while,
kicked out of the club for saying that.
I mean, kick me out then. Like the thing where you accidentally double click on the title bar, and the window becomes enormous, and there's no trivial single click move to get back, is not a well engineered.
Not good UX, you might say.
I don't know if it's UX or UI, but I know it's not good.
Well, you've had a bad experience based on some user interaction.
I've tried to sort of start teasing out a few of the things you've said and try to capture them into these notes. So UX, you're saying, is about the user experience in terms of really, like, literally how the users experience the system, like on the way to accomplish their goals.
Right.
And UI is where how it looks and how it works live. Now that's interesting because I think I've heard other folks, I'm not saying necessarily experts, but just sort of casual, layperson's initial understanding, where they would put how something works, like how it behaves, into user experience. But that's actually not true, I think.
That's not really what I was trying to say. Yeah, I would put the how it works and the composition of UI elements even into the UX bucket.
So, like, what is the boundary between UI and UX? Do we even know?
Well, something that I had heard recently was that we were actually talking to a UX UI engineer, and I'd ask them, when you have a project, typically what is the deliverable that comes out of that project? And I had given an example of, is it CSS? Is it components in a native language? Is it graphics from something like Adobe XD? And they correctly answered that actually it's none of those things. It is a series of diagrams and screen flows and explanations of how the system work as both text and low fidelity to medium fidelity mockups. And so to me that was them passing that test of understanding that UI design and like that actual developer level product was not what, in this case, we were necessarily after. We wanted someone who knew how to do that user research and actually develop hey, here's how we think this feature actually needs to work and behave, independent of one particular UI implementation.
Yeah. So the interesting thing is that if you kind of look back a ways in time, I feel like some things that are currently in the UX bucket or used to live in the UI bucket before UX was kind of even a thing. Because some of the ideas like you're talking about now are things that 20 years ago would have been commonly understood to be part of the UI. So I feel like UX sort of carved out some things that were in the UI bucket and then added more around user experience and research and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think we're finding out that as we get better at each layer and tier of the software development process, like there simply is more like room to specialize within an aspect of what we're doing. And as we get better at those individual characteristics, just like with UX UI, we find out that, hey, we could actually build an entire discipline of this UI practice of simply learning how to communicate with our users and developing a flow for the system. And after a time, you end up moving out of that UI design aspect to just focus on the experience.
So we have a comment coming in live. I just brought up from Harry. Harry attends our Angular. Well, until 2020 happened, I believe Harry was at every single Angular lunch. So yeah, this is great, right? So UX is grabbing this idea of like testability. The sort of there's like a data drivenness that seems to be important in the UX space that was maybe more casual judgment based before UX became an important factor.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a really good point in that he's describing the quantifiable thing that you're trying to succeed at as a UX specialist, as opposed to like the things that you do to achieve that goal.
So before we tease apart the boundary of UX and UI, I'll hide these notes so they don't take up our whole stream here. But let's try to figure out like what do people mean when they say designer versus developer? Kind of, we're trying to find ways to aggregate what we see across many projects at many substantially large teams, companies that are our customers, without ever revealing anything inappropriate about any actual customer to whom we are all sworn secrecy. But to me, just at the top level, when we hear about the need for more developers, that almost always means people that are going to write code to do a thing, where most often the appearance aspects, the UI and the UX, have most often been decided. Most often, if somebody says, I just want a developer, they often mean that how it's supposed to be experienced from the user is probably already in a file somewhere or already underway. Now, not always, right? Some people have a broader boundary, but that's my understanding. Go ahead.
Well, are we starting with the assumption that we're talking about front-end developers? Because there's the whole world of back-end developers that don't do anything that directly is involved with UI and UX. And they're the users of what they write are the people who consume their APIs, are other developers. And so, I don't think that type of developer is going to interface at all with this. And so, like, there was a question earlier, do we think that eventually it'll be table stakes for all developers to need to know more about UI UX? Well,
I meant all front-end developers, I think.
Okay. Maybe you said that and I missed it. I'm not sure. There's so many different types of developers. I have never been the type of developer who's been writing embedded systems in military hardware.
Yeah, so I clarified that here on the notes, just in case anyone arrives late to our stream, does not think we don't know what you just said. We are talking about the world of front-end and or user interface system development. We're not talking about the other 7 major worlds of software development. Clearly somebody building an embedded system. Well, if that embedded system has a UI, maybe we're talking about that part. But a person who's building the embedded part of the embedded system, it's not really helpful in the scope of what we're talking about here. So within the scope of front-end systems, I guess web or otherwise, not really web-centric, what is our sense of what people mean when they say, this person is a developer, this person is a designer, or I need another developer for this role. I need some more designers. My team, my team needs designers on it. Like what do people mean when they say those.
Yeah, and I'm trying to think as you say that, like if there's any shorthand that I can come up with, but every example I come up with, it won't quite work. These are fuzzy lines, and they're probably lines that will change over time. Even if it's a developer, someone who's going to write JavaScript or something that compiles to JavaScript. Well, there's a lot of things that compile to JavaScript.
Yeah, I think that the JavaScriptness is irrelevant because you could be doing a native app. I think everything we're talking about today is not scoped to web.
Yeah, well, I'm just trying to. That's part of the problem. What is an example? Like, a developer. The first thing that came to mind is a developer is someone who writes code, and a designer wouldn't write code. Okay, then what's the definition of code? And I don't have a good answer for your question because every time I try to formulate a sentence that would answer it, well, no, I have an objection to that.
So how about this as a draft? And I don't think this is the whole story, right? I keep changing the words at the top. Fuzzy overlapping boundaries. Maybe a developer is someone who codes to meet some kind of design spec. And maybe a designer is someone who creates that design spec. Someone who, and so the languages used are of course irrelevant, right? It's the designer decides the button will be light blue. The developer makes the button be light blue. Is that the boundary?
Well, depends on, once again, fuzzy boundaries. I have clients that consider the design team to consist of designers who are capable of implementing the design spec in some sort of reusable form.
Yeah. So how about this? People usually span these to some extent.
Yeah.
Teams almost always. Right, so you could have a design team where the team overall is primarily responsible for work that kind of falls in the UX UI bucket, but that team in the process of implementing things is probably going to do things that feel like development and things that feel like design. And so there's going to be people of varying mixed skill sets. And so just because there is a design team doesn't mean that the only work that can ever happen there are things that would strictly be in a design bucket. Chris, I know you've worked on a couple of our especially large customers. And kind of just, looking back, in fact, I know you've worked on many very large customer things over some years. What range of kind of, I guess, team behavior have you seen in terms of the dividing line between deciding like what the thing will look like and how it will behave in response to poking at it versus coding it to do that? Strict lines, soft lines?
Usually what's happened is that whoever's designing the actual, like how the screen should look exactly and how it should behave is usually pretty far removed from how things are actually implemented and can work. And so usually the friction there is that, the designers are too far removed from what is possible and what is like normal in actually writing the CSS and the HTML and what's reasonable to do and what isn't. And so being asked to do things where the value of what you're being asked to do is not comparable to the amount of effort it's going to take to do it, given like limitations of HTML or CSS and things like that. And so for me, it's always the frustration that I wish the designers were a little closer to understanding again, these are just the situations I've been in, but a little closer to understanding like the actual HTML and CSS and how things really behave. The most extreme example was, somebody in another country with Photoshop making up screens and they can draw whatever they want to in Photoshop and then send it. And that was kind of like the worst, one where, there's lots of different tools designers use, and some of them are closer than others to the end product, right? With some of them actually producing actual CSS and things like that. The Photoshop one, I think, was the worst, where, some person with no real development experience at all was just drawing up pretty pictures in Photoshop and then hitting some sort of export button and producing really unusable stuff and shipping it to us and expecting us to just match that. So there's been kind of different levels of that. I'm always, wishing that the designers had a little bit more understanding of actual HTML and CSS. And then obviously as the developers, it's like we need to come together somewhere in the middle and be able to speak a common language.
So the way I've heard that described, I just added to the notes here, is the idea that if the design work is happening sort of in the same medium as the design will be realized, then it's there's much more opportunity to optimize both for how natural the result feels in that medium and how cost and time efficient it is to implement that. Starting kind of at the kind of early days of web, it was nearly universal. By the way, someone could click whatever the equivalent on your OS is of do not disturb, because we keep getting somebody's bings on are coming through our stream. I don't think it's mine. I think I have mine do not disturb, but somebody's is acting up. Okay, so this idea of being in the medium, like with UX, like would that mean you kind of want the designers to be working in HTML and CSS, not in Photoshop?
Or at least, just to at least have some understanding. Like I said, there's lots of different tools out there that designers are using, and some of them are closer than others. Like Photoshop was kind of the extreme, where they're literally just like, okay, I'm going to draw a screen and then like send you some stuff, and it just, none of it was really usable. Whereas I know there are other tools that are better designed for that can export closer, CSS and things. And
I actually, sorry, go ahead.
Okay. One of the most recent projects I was working on, the designers were trying really hard. I don't remember which tool they were using. It was a pretty good tool. They were trying really hard to get everything pixel perfect, and it would output the CSS and everything like that. And but they were taking very much a screen by screen approach, and then there was a lot of work for me as a developer to come along and like sort of extract out that information, extract out these rules. Like I know the designers have these rules they're going off of in their head to implement these screen mockups, but it's like then I have to come along and do a whole nother step of trying to figure out, okay, I'm looking at these 3 screens. They all have this sort of common element. Okay, this must be the rule. Like I apply this padding when X, and it's like, it just seemed like there was a whole extra layer of work for me to get information, to arrive at information that they already knew in their head, and it wasn't really being communicated well. It just seems like there needs to be a better way to document that than just looking at these screens and looking at the CSS properties. I can go into each element, look at the CSS properties, but like as a developer, I'm looking for the overall rules to apply, not to do each element on its own. It's just like, yeah, go ahead.
I actually pulled on this thread. I had a client come to me and was trying to understand the relationship between their design team, their development team, their overall architecture team, and then us as yet another kind of contracted entity in the realm of their software development. And they were trying to figure out why it was so difficult to come up with kind of a common language that all these teams could use when discussing the design of their system. And so I had the task put to me of like trying to figure out, hey, what is it that we can do, that we can equip the designers with to help them speak our language as developers? And like I had been wanting to answer that question for a long time, and now someone's going to cut a check for me to go find the answer. Like, I was on the task, on mission, and so I dug into this, and one of the first things that I had found right out of the gate, there's two aspects of it. One is that these design tools are design tools that, for the most part, are actually used in an agnostic manner that have nothing necessarily to even do with producing screens and mockups for web development. These are the same tools that are used to make desktop application designs and mobile application designs and any other kind of platform you'd want to build for, sometimes not even applications themselves. And so, like, at that base general level, these tools are not necessarily meant for that. Sure, some are more specialized than others. Some are specifically meant for making web applications. But then you come to the second thing, which I discovered, and that is the notion of component-based web development is still pretty new in the grand scheme of things, especially when compared to the need for visual designs and design tools. The components are just like a drop in the bucket of the history of app development.
I have so many threads to pull on, but keep going. I'm writing down the threads to pull on here.
And so, like this notion of we're going to translate these designs into web components, Angular components, React components, whatever components, is like not a native construct of like the entire designer ecosystem. They have a notion of a component that is completely different and totally disconnected from ours. And so as I started to unpack it, I found that when we say component, they have something completely different that they're visualizing in their mind. And the tooling of all of these systems, you'd basically have to build a full-on no-code system, no-code platform to even get them to be able to produce design specifications that understand the same language of granularity of component-based design that we would like them to be able to speak. And that was kind of the summarized version of what I ended up producing for the client.
So I'm going to pull on a few threads there. As I've been thinking about what you've been saying, I think that the thing I think that unifies all of the ideas around this are, as the sort of hopefully senior technologists brought in, our role is to help our decision maker clients understand the world of the trade-offs in which they're making decisions around these things. So, for example, should a web application look like a web application, right? Just like in the ethics sense, what should a web application look like? Anything you want, and then you just squeezed hard enough to make the browser put those pixels on the screen? Or is there some webness that a web application should have? Now, I'm not trying to answer that question, but I'm saying we should make sure that decision makers understand that their answer to that question and sort of how much leash they give teams in their organization to put their preferences on that answer could have very big effects on the budget and timeline of their project. And so just sort of going into that blind, they say, well, I'm just going to delegate to this design team to do whatever they want. Well, if you have a conversation and decide to constrain the design team to make web things that are kind of more webby, to sort of make up an adjective, you're probably going to have a lower cost and time of implementation. And that's not to say that that's the right thing to do, but if you don't care, if you don't have a preference for going pretty far away from web-like interfaces, unless you need to stray pretty far from kind of the typical appearance of web things, you're probably going to save time and budget by nudging your design teams. Don't design in Photoshop, design in the medium to build things more readily implemented in the medium.
I mean, that sounds similar to what we say on other scales, other scopes of, if you're going to be working in Angular material, then the closer you are to just using Angular material as it is, and the less you try to modify it, the easier time you'll have. So basically just, and if you're doing a Java layout, the more you just do things the normal Java way, the less you're fighting against yourself.
That's a great point. So at both the micro level, all the way up to the macro level of like, what software are we even building? You need to be willing to fight the platform only to the extent you're getting some value out of fighting the platform. I think we have seen at many scales, in many cases, places where our customers are like kind of unintentionally fighting the platforms, where nobody set out and said, I understand the trade-offs, but there's so much greatness to be achieved for our organization by fighting the platform on this that we're going to do so, even though it's going to triple the budget. I don't know how many of those have happened. I think it's more likely there are more typically accidental cases of fighting the platform. Just, maybe someone just didn't think any better. I picked up Photoshop and I just made this concept. And then the concept was handed over to someone who went to implement it, and it was very difficult.
I had a project a few years ago where the designer we had was not trained as a designer. He was, and a subject matter expert in what the company did. And he was used to seeing Windows apps. And so he insisted that our web app needed to have a file menu inside the app. And couldn't even really describe what the file menu was supposed to have, but we need to have a file menu because that's what apps have in the upper left. So
that's actually maybe a little bit further case, right? That's not even so much like fighting the platform to reach some Platonic ideal. It just means that you need to be careful not to take the patterns from one medium and drop them into another medium, because then you can create something that feels really weird in the destination medium and is slow and expensive to implement. And I think hardly any business level decision makers at any customer I've ever met would set out to intentionally fight the medium they're using, run up their cost and budget to sort of, idiosyncratically grab a different platform's patterns. But I can easily see it happening, and have seen it happening by accident.
So Kyle, you
this too, but
go ahead.
Sorry, when I've seen that when a customer is moving from traditionally having all say Windows desktop-based apps, and they're trying to move it to a web platform, but they're still very hung up on not wanting to lose the original look and feel. So then they're putting a lot of effort into making all of their new versions look exactly like their old versions, even though they're really moving to a different paradigm and stuff.
That is a great segue back to the heart of this topic, and that actually, Kyle, if you had that document a second ago, you wrote a very important phrase on there. Two words.
Let me get it up here.
Was
go ahead.
Product owner.
Yeah.
The product owners, and I know we're not supposed to pick on our clients. I'm not going to pick on a client. I'm going to pick on every client I've ever had. The product owner is not the UX expert, but every product owner fancies themselves the UX expert. And
I'm going to define the product owner as whoever is going to experience the career or financial consequences of the trade-offs that were made.
Yep.
It's
like Chris's story. Yeah, that's spot on. And in Chris's story there, the product owner has this innate fear that if they change where they put this button when they upgrade to a new platform, that all of their users are going to get out the pitchforks and start a strike the very next day. I have experienced this with literally everyone, and it is truly built. It's truly out of FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, that the employees can actually be flexible and learn and grow and and adapt to change. And it's that's our number one ability as human beings, is to be able to adapt to change.
It's like the defining characteristic, right?
Yeah, yeah, and for whatever reason, every product owner, well, the reason's pretty clear. It's because they're the ones that are experiencing the bulk of the risk, right?
Yeah.
They like to hold on to that user experience because we know that user experience, at the end of the day, is regardless of the actual numeric outcome of like whatever effort you're trying to build, that user experience can overcome like every other indicator that your effort was successful.
Absolutely.
If a few key people think it wasn't because of their own perceptions of the experience they had using that software. So
go ahead.
I just just an open plea to anyone listening of like, if you're a product owner, like, of course you're worried and concerned, like you're the one taking on the risk, but you are not trained as an actual UX engineer to understand what your users can or can't actually figure out and adapt to.
So I have a micro tip for anyone in the audience who finds in that position. Sometimes you can take a meaningful step forward, get aligned with a new platform and so on in a way that lowers cost and risk of implementation, and yet maintain compatibility with your existing crew of human users with careful attention to tab order and keyboard shortcuts. These things are often paid little attention in web app development, but careful at just getting it where the fields go through in the order that a well-trained user expects can be the difference between that resistance and pitchforks versus grumpy for a couple of days, but then ultimately very happy. So before we try to loop back to like the key issue, like, is it a good idea to try to combine the development and UI UX versus split them? So we need to get back there. That's what we promised on the 10, and some of our viewers are probably going to start getting pitchforks out if we don't get back eventually. But on something I think near to your heart, Paul, I know you've been working with Blazor somewhat, and I've been working with Flutter somewhat, and both of these they share a characteristic depending on the deployment model, which is of running inside the web, but in a not very web DOM native way. Like, what if we basically built a desktop style development environment or a native mobile style development environment, and then we use WASM or similar, draw it on a canvas, essentially modern new web technologies to create a UI that doesn't necessarily, or really arguably can't, sort of feel like a web app. And I find myself really wondering if maybe the sort of I say occasional default inclination we've seen to take a native feeling design and try to find a way to shove it into the web, it's possible that might actually drive pretty significant adoption of both Blazor and Flutter, because we can argue about whether it's really a great idea to deploy things that are pretty far from native web apps on the web. But setting aside whether it's a good idea, I think maybe this generation of tools might actually pick up a tailwind. There may be some unmet demand, people that have been wanting to do designs, applications that don't feel at all like a web application, and have them run efficiently in a browser tab. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that stuff?
Well, I think that is an interesting idea, may have some legs, but I think the inverse might also be true, in that like we are moving beyond the need to be restricted by the paradigms of the DOM, and yet we keep building that.
That could be too.
That we keep building those things, and we need not be restricted in that way.
Yeah.
Now, I think we're seeing a generation of tools that have been so focused on allowing developers to build in a web-like way that we're also accidentally boxing ourselves in to a web-like experience when the platform is starting to transcend its traditional roots.
Yeah, so I guess, so what unifies all four of us is that we've all had tremendous amount of experience writing a huge amount of code, helping customers with a lot of code, fixing problems in bodies of code, helping organize bodies of code. We, the four of us, are all pretty code-centric. So maybe if we stand back and try to put ourselves in that product owner role, there may be some merit to say, well, perhaps we should look to achieve that alignment between working in the medium and doing versus the medium, having the design work in the medium. Maybe we achieve that by modifying our medium to be closer to the kind of flexibility that people in the UX design world want. This has kind of been my hobby horse for a while, in which I think that someday we're going to see major enterprise apps written on game engines. I haven't seen it happen yet, but I think it will. Was there anything else on this long diversion? Yeah, go ahead.
Quick interjection, like seeing major business apps built on game engines. I was recently consulting with someone about the idea of building medical web interfaces using a game engine for Canvas.
I love it. I love it. I want to fly through something. Okay, so Paul, you and I have been using up too many words. So I'm hoping Lance and Chris are going to jump in as we try to loop back and take another swing at the heart of the supposed topic for today. So I'm going to click and get this back up on the stream here. So there's this question of, does it really make sense to try to have the same people, some of the same people, be designing and developing? Does it make sense to try to find and hire developers who have some, not even differentiating UX and UI, who have some UX and or UI skills? Does it make sense to hire designers who have some coding skills so that they're maybe coding some of the components in your application? Or does it make more sense to go back the other direction and have more of a clear boundary? This group A designs and throws something over a wall, and group B implements per the spec. And I'm not saying as a value judgment which is better. I'm saying as a practical matter, under what conditions in the sort of enterprise project world we work in, or product world we sometimes work in, under what conditions should people be looking to go one way or the other on that?
Can I just interject for a minute?
It's all yours.
Here we say developer codes to meet a design spec, designer creates a design spec. But my biggest problem is, what is a design spec that makes sense? So going back to my last experience, the designers were working really hard in this tool, but the tool was very page focused. And then they were taking screenshots of that and then trying to write up rules in a wiki page. And it was there was no consolidated spec that really felt like something I would call a specification that I could actually look at and not have to do a whole lot of work to pull the pieces together and formulate rules. It's what is the format? If CSS isn't the spec itself, if there needs to be something else, what is that thing? Or is CSS the spec and the designers need to be able to produce it? So it's first we need to define what is a design spec, what should it look like, before we can figure out who needs to be able to read or understand that.
So, that's right at the heart of our question, right?
Yeah.
Because if your answer is going to be there's a clear separation of design and development, design and implementation, then you've got to have some sort of just rock solid, very precise specification in between.
And that's what I would argue for.
We've already accidentally got back in our developer brains though, and have narrowed it down to this idea of a visual design spec that leaves out the user experience specification.
I was trying to get behavior in there,
which may or may not actually be encoded jointly with the design spec. You could have, I have heard of firms that have a UX team that is separate from their UI team.
Yeah, that's why we have all fuzzy overlapping boundaries. Okay, so here's my answer to Chris's notion, which I really think is, this always happens, right? We are 49 minutes in. I think Chris's observation gets actually right to the heart of the question that I threw out there, and kind of almost invalidates the question, right? I think this question I started with is borderline invalid because of this point Chris made. And that is the work of taking an idea and specifying it so closely that a computer can execute it. That work is called software development. And so to the extent you actually have to nail down an exact specification in some language of how a system will appear and behave, if someone is doing that, translating between an approximate idea and a precise spec, that person is a software developer, even if they never write a single line of code, even if they've never written JavaScript and don't know what a C++ is.
Let me throw out an acronym.
Is that nonsense?
Yeah.
Or is that?
I think it's onto something, but let me throw out this acronym and see how you reconcile it. HCI.
I reconcile it by reducing my font size because my notes no longer fit. So HCI, that's a human-computer interfacing. That's like a field of academic study, right?
I would say it is.
Well, and commercial
starting
work.
To become, yeah, it is well beyond that, just academics now.
It's something you can get a degree in. It's something in which you can publish papers and earn a PhD. Right? It's a serious thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. And then there are people who are hiring such folks
to
work on their software products as well.
Absolutely. So my impression is that is sort of the broader or more academic idea that kind of gathers up all these things that we've been talking about and kind of takes them seriously. That's my impression. Like, I don't think HCI is a wholly different thing than UX or UI. I think it's like a maybe broader, more holistic look at UX, UI, and other aspects of design.
Yeah, I thought they were more or less synonymous. I took an
I have.
We looked at screen design.
Yeah, and I am not an expert on the idea of HCI, but my exposure to it has been through the lens of folks describing it as the most mature version of UX, of user experience, of that slice of it, and that it is specifically focused on thing. Actually, Harry just now dropped a quote. We probably want to grab his quote and get it on here.
Sure.
Again. He's describing it as like cognitive ergonomics, UX, usability, user-centered design.
Here we go.
Yeah, like that has been my exposure to the idea of HCI, is that it seems to be kind of almost a formalization of the ideas that a UX engineer is thinking on.
Yeah, that was my impression. It's like the broader field that kind of goes around a bunch of these ideas, and these become parts of that field, and they're studied like in a much more like probably rigorous way than we would ever have the occasion kind of on the ground of creating software systems. Like I said, this is something you can earn a PhD in. You can do research and have it peer reviewed. I mean, it's serious, heavy work.
Now with user experience, that seems to be like a subset that's focused on, specifically in this world of software, typically for a particular product or group of products, but it still relies very heavily on research methodologies, and the formal application of it to create these user flows for applications. And what is produced that I have seen is, again, those screen flows and those ideas that need further work before they can become a specification.
Yeah.
So,
because to me,
how does that fit into this model that we're talking about now of like they're all software engineers?
I'm thinking about that. So the challenge here is that creating a precise specification, so precise that it can actually be executed, is inherently a programming thing to do. And yet, if you try to separate design and implementation, then there is a tendency for that part to be sort of stranded, right? I think this manifests the way Chris was saying, where you can have a mock-up which is maybe statically specifies, right? You could sort of look at it and you could make something that has that same appearance, but a mock-up with some words around it is going to have a really hard time, like specifying with the level of precision it takes to write code, whether that code is HTML, CSS, JavaScript, Fortran, whatever, to go implement anything. Which I think I just brushed over the. So there's sort of a faction of I guess Twitter, angry Twitter mobs that try to claim that like HTML and CSS are not code. And I would argue that they are code because I've worked with other declarative things. The mere fact that HTML and CSS are declarative doesn't make them not code. So to me, if a person is trying to so precisely specify something that they're crafting HTML, CSS, then they are, at least within that domain, programming, developing.
So many of the parts of this conversation we've had for the last hour have really been philosophy about definitions. What is code? What is design? What's a developer? And none of these things are hard and fast and immutable concepts. What we say today is UX and UI and a developer and a designer and a product owner and stuff like all these things. As the technologies change and as experience changes in 20 years, people will have different terms, and some of it will just be a new term because that the industry needs to rename things, but some of it will be the concepts themselves will have shifted. And UX, what we parts of UX that we now think of as one thing will be 3 different things that people will look back and say, wow, at one point they considered those all together. That's amazing.
To me, it's a good thing that we're working on the philosophy here. Because inside of a project, especially a project has a deadline looming, it's often unhelpful to bring up the fact that there's some philosophy that needs to be figured out, right? Just because, you have to read the room, and in the middle of a project, if you're starting to talk about the fact there's a philosophical problem, you're probably not reading the room very well. You're probably not going to be well received. And yet, many of these things we're trying to figure out, they absolutely are philosophy. The great thing is that this room we're in, this is our show, and so this is a good time and place to talk about the philosophy of it, because people who don't want to hear about it don't have to listen. But that's right. It's philosophy. Maybe we should rename the channel.
Yeah, the philosophy of, I don't know, something.
Yeah. Get back to the specification thing for a minute.
Yeah.
Well, specification, then that is code. But we're the developers who are creating the apps. We're doing complicated logic in Angular, or maybe we're doing React, and it might change from day to day. And that's not really that relevant to the designer, right? Like what kind of other frameworks and stuff we're using, but it'd just be more efficient if there was some sort of specification language or whatever you want to call it that they could use, that really it didn't matter if I'm doing Angular or React or Vue or anything, just some common way that as they go from project to project and maybe these other technologies change, that they could, really in a very logical way put down those rules. I know they have these rules in their head of why things should be a certain way and when, and they need to be able to communicate that to me as a developer so that I can then translate that into whatever language or technology we're using. It just seems like right now the tools that they have don't necessarily do a good job of that, they're just showing screen mock-ups and not really looking at it in terms of what are the rules that need to be extracted for the developer to then actually go apply. There's just this, I'm doing a lot of work to recreate this mental model that I know the designers already have in their head, but they have no way to communicate that to me.
Yeah, that's on a couple projects ago, I was with a Fortune 500 company, and I never heard of real design philosophy, but they did have a library of components. And I think we were supposed to take those and use those as examples and figure it out from there. But it's a very different thing looking at that versus looking at material design, where it's all about a conceptual look. And material design isn't telling you how to write the components. It's how to think about how you're designing things. And I have a client meeting, so I need to get going. See you in a couple weeks.
We'll miss you, Lance, but we'll keep talking. So
are we?
I'm gonna go ahead. I was gonna spin off of what Lance said and ask something. But you go right ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. I'm about to turn the corner on something.
So Lance just pointed out material design. Okay, and I have to think that this question about the designer developer boundary inevitably comes into contact with, are we adopting something off the shelf that accelerates our progress, or are we starting with an empty screen and no pixels and starting to draw? So I think that probably ought to get addressed here. But then secondly, the thing that Chris is talking about, like how to specify behavior, the thing that Lance described material design as doing, it does do, but actually one of my complaints is I wish it did more. I know that Paul, I know you and I have like sat together looking around at all of the, sifting through their published materials, and then also looking at sort of known good, respected examples of using that specific design system to try to figure out like what is the way in that design system to solve a certain kind of design problem. Because I think there really is a lot of desire, both from people who would call themselves designers and developers, to consume systems that include guidance or even components, tools that will tell you like, what are you supposed to do? How are you supposed to use this thing? One of my complaints is sometimes with material design or sometimes with Angular material, it seems like here is a bucket of components. Paul has a guest. Here's a bucket of components. Good luck figuring out what is the right way to put these together in a coherent, sensible way on a screen. You're going to have to go look somewhere else for that. And I'm not blaming the team or saying that they have to solve all problems, but I feel like if something really is a great design system, would include both. Here are some components, regardless of the kind of technology involved, and here are the rules, like you keep saying, Chris, for what are you supposed to do? Like when you have give me some guidelines so that if 3 different designers pick up the same design system to solve a certain problem, they'll at least be somewhere in the same vicinity talking about the trade-offs with each other. They won't all be starting from an empty screen, inventing completely different designs, even though they're purportedly using, like, it's not a design system to me if the 3 of us could build something that looked completely different in every way and they were ad hoc, but the buttons all had a nice matching hue. Like that wouldn't make it a design system. Soapbox mode off.
Yeah, and this actually kind of, leaving that unanswered though, I think is kind of important for the next point that I was going to ask, which is coming back down to like the literal title of this episode is unicorn or table stakes.
Yeah.
And to me, like there's a even more fundamental question, and that is like, well, what are you trying to build? Like what you're trying to build, like will determine whether or not like someone who thinks that they can do a little bit of all of this is sufficient or not, and how many of those specialties you need to bring in to succeed at whatever goal you're setting out to achieve.
I'm going to propose an answer. Okay. Sometimes if I propose an answer, there's something good down the road, and sometimes it's noise. So here we go. The extent to which you should hire, you should go to the extra effort of finding people who have this unicorn combination of great design and great programming capabilities all in one. That should be proportional to the extent to which you're sort of breaking new ground, like you're not just doing something that's like yet another internal app just like all the others, and the extent to which having really especially great user experience is going to make a major financial impact on the success of the effort you have underway. And so at one end, if you're out there trying to make a consumer electronic widget and you're trying to compete with Apple, you should bring it. You should leave no stone unturned. to find people who get a whole team of unicorns if you can, because you're going to need everything to align perfectly to achieve that nearly impossible goal. If you are a small company building an internal system for 18 users, then you should go figure out the most off-the-shelf thing you possibly can. And you should not like go shopping for unicorns to solve sort of a small scale problem. And of course, our customers are partway in between there, right? Sometimes they have an internal system, but so we work on internal systems that have 10,000 users or 50,000 users occasionally. And so those are somewhere down that spectrum. So I would say the farther you are down the spectrum where you really need the utmost in a polished, great user experience and appearance, the more you'll get a return on seeking designers who are also unicorns who can also code, and developers who are unicorns who can also design. What do you think?
I think that's. Go ahead, Chris.
Oh, I feel like so I've mostly worked on internal apps at large customers, and
Sure.
I feel like I've seen where they want it to look different and super cool and whatever, and it's like they're putting more. There isn't that value in making it look super spectacular. Like they're focusing too much on making it look different and cool than they are on the actual what do we actually need for the functionality. And since it is an internal app that everybody has to use anyway, what is really the value? They're not trying to sell this to compete with some other fancy UI. This is the app to buy the pencils, internally, and yet they're spending a lot of time with designers just trying to kind of like prove their art or something and making really fancy designs that probably aren't necessary for the actual function. It's like you're not really trying to sell this to anybody other than to be like, look at the cool app we made.
Well,
so you're saying,
yeah.
So for internal apps that aren't out there trying to like seize market share,
right?
You should be rigorously functionality first.
Well, I think so. What Chris is describing was another case of the product owner thinking they are the UX person. Like sure. they have made a preemptive subconscious decision to fall into the trap of enforcing a schism and a split of roles that make it impossible to just hire a few good, well-balanced people across all of those tiers, because they have accidentally, while birthing the idea, taken on the role of the UX designer. Like while birthing the idea, they have forced that split at the inception of the software project without even meaning to, without even realizing it was a thing.
So do we think a good guideline would be, unless your team is so small there's just no other way, you're probably better off as a product owner being primarily focused on the user can achieve their goals type outcomes, and maybe try to delegate particularly the expensive parts, the parts that might lead to extra cost of UX decisions. Try to get somebody else to take those on, so that as the product owner, you don't become dug in too much to your own idiosyncrasies.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly healthy, but I think that, like, I was mostly trying to point out, like, to a certain extent, like, you may not have any control over that. Like, you might have accidentally made that decision before you've even arrived at this question.
Yeah, you're saying that you might be the UX designer and not even know it, not even have decided it, just sort of landed that way because of the way your organization works. Yeah,
and it makes me wonder, like, we had the question here as unicorn or table stakes, but there's a in theory, there's a spectrum of everything in between.
Well, yeah, that was the whole point. Where who needs to be where on the spectrum?
And like in those situations where the product owner, accidentally becomes the UX designer, what is left for them to potentially dole out and reconsider? Like there's the rest of the software development cycle that they can then divvy up amongst their team and figure out who to hire but having retained the role of UX for themselves, like, is it even possible to find like the kind of unicorns that we were talking about that can do everything that would actually be effective on that product with that role being held back?
I think a factor that drives some product owners at organizations to take on a lot of the UX and UI design work is that at some organizations, there's just sort of a long history of assuming that these roles are totally separate, and that developers might even have been selectively hired for being of the inclination on the developer side to try to not have an opinion, to be neutral on what the appearance or behavior is, right? Because if you're in an organization where there's like supposed to be a strong gap, that's like their organizational decision is to have like a gap between these, then a developer who really has like, strong opinions and maybe even has some experience, some knowledge, they're going to like feel visceral pain when asked to implement sort of objectively bad UI or UX. And so it may be that organizations sort of end up with people who are recruited, who stay because of the way the organization works. And so this might be almost entirely path dependent. If you're at an organization that treats these as separate, you're probably stuck treating them as separate. If you're an organization that wants UX developers, people who span the two, then you're probably going to shape your processes and shape your team assignments in a way that relies on spanning the two. So I don't think we've helped anybody that came to us for the original question. I'm going to try to help. I think if you are a brand new to the industry, just entering, maybe coming out of school, maybe not coming out of school, it would behoove you to understand enough UX and UI that as a developer, you could step into a UX developer role if that is, if that's what's needed, that you could be that person if needed.
Alternatively to that, if you can scope your problem so that you or a small team of people like you can achieve your goal with a rather narrow set of expertise across those bands, like that is another viable path to success. Case study, Flappy Bird.
Yeah. Well, that's a one-person team, right?
Yep.
They are the developer, they're the UI, they're the UX, they're the product owner, they're the product designer.
And like you look at the graphics to know that like this person was not a 3D visual graphics savant, and yet
yeah.
they went on to become
quite successful.
Wildly successful.
Yeah.
And so that scoping of what we're trying to achieve, like when done well, can also upset the need to think too hard on this question.
Yeah. So I'm trying to think if I just don't have a clear enough memory to count. I'd love to be able to make a tally out of every project I've ever touched, customers great and small. It's sort of like, tally them in my mind along the lines of trying to divide out the design and development roles versus trying to integrate them. Unfortunately, I don't have numbers, although maybe someone else here will say, oh, I just thought back on my last 5 projects and have some numbers. But when I think back, the other obvious driver that I guess probably should have, this maybe even like the most obvious factor is team size. If your team size is 1, yeah, they're the designer, they're the developer, they're everything, they're every role. If the team size is 1,000 people working on one product, then inevitably there's going to be a much finer grained division of roles. And so, like kind of the extent to which this is a philosophical question is really when you have a medium-sized team and you kind of could go either way. You have some flexibility. Do we try to integrate? Do we try to divide the roles? That's when the decision comes into play. Like I said, Paul, if your Flappy Bird example, that person didn't make a decision. They're the only person. They had to do all the roles. Go ahead.
Yeah, but I would say that the number of people on a project is actually a symptom of what I was describing, which is like, what are you trying to achieve?
Yeah.
You know, like you don't say I'm going to make Flappy Bird and go hire 1,000 developers.
Great comment from the audience here that basically what we're talking about, you could have this exact same, very similar discussion, analogous discussion about other edges of development. Are your developers also database administrators, or is that a separate role in an organization? And I would even say, like, we could probably all come back and have the same conversation, but not this week because we've already been going an hour, 15 minutes, about, like, this applies to DevOps. Like the fundamental DevOps idea of developers being responsible for operation of what they're developing is analogous in many ways to, are developers designing the thing they're developing, or is that like a handoff to a completely different role? Okay, hopefully we gave time to Chris to think. What do you think, Chris? Kind of thinking back across projects.
Oh, I was just going to point out that one thing that I noticed that's been a problem for places that separate things out. So, having a dedicated DBA is great. Having dedicated designers is great. Having a dedicated DevOps team is great. But what I found is a tendency to, have one of each of those people and then, 20, 30, 40 developers, and they can't keep up. And so having a dedicated DBA or designer that you can actually collaborate with in a reasonable way is a great resource. But when the ratio is 1 to 20 or 1 to 50, then it becomes a bottleneck, and there's too much disconnect, and the designs are pretty far from what you're dealing with, and it just becomes a huge problem. So it's like,
well, and then you get reviewers.
What's that?
And then you get the reviewers that are accepting it, not knowing if any collaboration even took place.
Yeah, and then you have the testing team who's coming along like, well, this doesn't exactly match this spec. I'm like, well, I couldn't talk to that guy because he's got 20 other people to talk to.
Right.
Did the best they could. It's like you need these, like, that idea of having, like, kind of small integrated teams where a tester, a designer, a DBA, and developers are working closely together. Like that works pretty well. But having one dedicated DBA or designer for 20 or 40 people does not work well.
So I worked on a project team at a company that did billions of dollars a year in business. It was a pretty good sized company. And for the whole family of projects, I was kind of a consultant helping out with some of the hard problems across the family of projects. And there was one key DBA and a couple kind of supporting DBAs for an entire, like, product suite. So if that person was out that week, like, no important changes could be designed or implemented.
Yeah.
Now, there's plenty of work to do doing less important, less structural challenges. So a lot of work would still happen. But if that person was away, just don't even think about taking on any, like, big essential problems that week. There was one person there responsible for, like, doing the builds. Nobody else could even actually, like, build the entire product suite. They could only build, like, the little part they're working on. And so there could be no integrative testing of the whole system if that person was on vacation that week, because there was no way to do a build. It wasn't like a process with a script. It was a human who knew what to do. It was quite remarkable in retrospect. Like, and this could have the same problem with design, right? Be careful. If your design is too isolated, then any kind of hiccup in how your teams are interacting, or if some people are away, or as Chris, you're describing, maybe you've not got the ratios correctly of how big each team is, you can have a bunch of people stuck, unable to make progress, but still costing money because the work's not spread out. So what do we have left on this thing? We've beat on this topic. Have we addressed the hard question we started with sufficiently?
I think so. I think we've painted a pretty good picture of the reality of the space that we see in our clients. We've taken a look at kind of the spectrum of what these terms are, and I think we've made some pretty good arguments as to the direction this is going to head.
So do we have any final advice for either developers that are thinking about growing some design skills and designers that are thinking about growing dev skills, and or advice for product owners, project managers about how to decide whether they should seek someone with both or not. Any more advice on those key answers? Like what do you tell your interns on whether they should be working on just one or the other, or learning both?
My advice to other developers is to acknowledge that there is a difference in the areas that you're working on, but don't let that stop you from fluidly going between all of them as it makes sense for the work you're doing.
Paul, I heard a rumor that you've been learning Adobe XD so that you can more effectively work with and communicate people across the whole spectrum. Is this true?
Yep. Yeah. I
certification really, of some kind, a T-shirt or anything, a hat?
I literally downloaded it, opened it up, started going through the tutorials, started going through the vast amounts of material out there on the web. And my purpose of it was not to like start designing my own things or designing for customers, but it was an immediate payoff and being able to just communicate with the other teams in their own language, and also be able to communicate to management about, hey, I understand what the design team's talking about here, and the restrictions and the constraints that they're dealing with, and I can actually work with them and the implementers and kind of bridge that gap in communication. You know,
so as
just
leaders,
in a very short amount of time.
Like as leaders, like we need to do that, right? Like we need to be able to work effectively, not only within one sort of narrow, I say, about a huge career area, but like we need to be able, when we're on teams, like we're usually brought in for like the hard problems to help customers who really need to be successful. Like we need to be prepared to be an intermediary if needed, to be able to understand people on all sides if there is a divide, and not kind of not be part of the problem anyway. So I think that's great. So now I feel guilty, Paul, that I haven't picked up Adobe XD yet. Chris, I'm looking on your bookshelf. Is there any Adobe XD back there?
There's so many different design tools out there. Like each client seems to be using a different one. Yeah. So.
I've been digging into that world, but it really looks like there's tremendous momentum shifting toward the Adobe stuff. And I don't know if I haven't used it. I don't know if it's technically better, but there just does seem to be a lot of momentum shifting there.
It has the crazy advantage of direct integration to the rest of the Adobe Creative Suite in the cloud.
But you have to did you actually install the Adobe stuff on your computer?
Just XD.
Because
all their products are
the manager, and then to uninstall it, you gotta go find 10 things, and
no.
I think they've cleaned that up.
Really?
Yeah,
I installed was it Premiere or something, just to do convert one video, and then getting it off my system again, because it was just constantly Adobe stuff running everywhere. It was just insane. I'm
that's a well-earned that is a well-earned reputation, but I think it's supposed to be pretty acceptable now. That's my impression.
It was only like 3 months ago.
Really?
Yeah.
Still had a bad experience. Yeah. I do know that the median Adobe tool user, they're not ever going to uninstall it, right? They'd be like, no, the only time this will get removed from my system is if I leave this job and the system gets repaved. Why would anyone ever uninstall the main tools you use for all of your work, right? So I think that's probably why maybe not as much attention is put into the uninstaller as some of us might prefer.
But just there were so many processes running. I'm I'm not using Adobe. Why are there 10 processes running when I'm not even using the software? Yeah. Checking for things.
Harry is coming through with an icon for us of a unicorn. So, well, I think I'm out of things to say. Should we call it quits? I'd say we're definitely not going to get to our candidate second. We had a candidate second topic, which we can keep for a future date because we're an hour and 24 minutes in. So I think we're done.
We want to tease it to get folks back next time.
I'm always nervous about teasing topics. I have so many topics, and we very often pivot our topic at the last minute. I guess we can tease. Our possible second topic was to talk about the trade-offs between adopting the same front-end library or framework kind of brutally across an entire company versus supporting a mix. But whether that'll be a topic next time, I don't know. We decide our topics week by week, just because we respond to the ideas that come our way, to things that that the group has to talk about. So that might resurface in 2 weeks, might resurface in 2 years. You'll have to stay tuned and subscribe and like and all that YouTube stuff that you're supposed to do, I guess. Okay, well, thank you for the audience. Thank you, Paul, Chris, Lance, who's gone already.
You bet. We'll see you next time.
Yep, we're out.